Good morning, everyone. We're ready to move ahead with new content for today, and we're going to start with Ang's Le Grand Odalisque. This is a piece that we've seen before because we talked about it with the tradition of the female nude, so it's something that'll be somewhat familiar to you as a point of review. Let me show you a little bit more information here by looking at some other works that kind of serve to back up what we know about Ang. Okay, first of all, I want you guys to be able to know how to say it. Ingres is not correct. Ang is what we've been taught to say. So Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, probably need to make a note that he is a student of Jacques-Louis David. Now, if you remember Jacques-Louis David, we were talking about the Oath of the Horatii and his involvement heavy-handed involvement in the French Revolution. We are now in the era of Napoleon, so I want you to make a connection to the neoclassical movement that came before. In this work that you're looking now on screen, The Apotheosis of Homer, it is a construction out of Ang's mind to celebrate everybody who's anybody to the literary tradition across the eras of time. It is an academic work in that it celebrates all of the learning and knowledge that's been accumulated by mankind. And it's a work that Ang worked on in sketch form over and over and over again. Guys, my very first visit to the Louvre, there was an entire show of nothing but preparatory sketches for this particular piece, and it showed how carefully he angst over each little piece or person or detail, every hand position, every facial detail. I mean, before he ever proceeded to color, he drew it and drew it and drew it. So that introduces a very important discussion. Ang is more of a draftsman in the way that we've seen Leonardo and Raphael and some of the others emphasize that idea of drawing first and coloring second. And we're getting to the point in the 19th century where that is going to become a super big deal, whether or not you follow the lessons of the Renaissance and draw everything first, or if you give over to your passions and proceed directly to color, rarely ever drawing a line. I want to show you basically the format of this thing. We've got Homer, the poet who wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, being turned into a deity or a god here. And around him on both sides are writers and thinkers from the classical past, as well as the not too distant past, the Renaissance, and contemporary French thinkers and writers. So it's meant to put everybody on a secure footing if they contribute to philosophy and thinking and literature. Some of the figures that you're seeing here are part of that 19th century discussion. Now, here is the drawing. And you can see every detail is rendered in black and white before color even enters Ang's mind. So that should help you remember with the Odalisque, that's exactly the way he started with that figure. He started with a drawing. Every little detail, hand positions, facial features, shading and chiaroscuro, all of those effects that are, classically modeled, those had to be sorted out by him first. So some of these figures are even going to be clothed. So you might wonder, why on earth would you spend so much time on the physicality of that human figure if he's eventually going to be wearing a toga? But this was necessary in Ang's process, so that's why we say he is a master of line. Some of you may have done that optional Smithsonian quiz. I'm just remembering mirror images. Ang shows up in that reading. And we think that his tool of choice was probably the camera lucida, which is a handheld device that's basically a lens, but it lets you see up close these dramatic details of line and shape and contour. So I want you to be aware of that. He was probably using some devices to aid and assist him. Of course, this video, this little diagram that you're looking at, they identify quite literally every single person that's here. And I don't think it's important for you to know that long list in yellow over at the right, but these are actual people. You need to be be aware. Some of them, if you scan that list, these are thinkers from the classical period, but then also artists from the Renaissance like Raphael, and other kinds of writers and thinkers who are to be emulated in Ong's mind. Okay, now the format should look oddly familiar to you, right? The School of Athens has a similar kind of balance and clarity. And if you are truly thinking of Ong as a neoclassicist, then balance and rational order are really important to you. We see something different though with Ong's female figure, so we're gonna try to see that as a hybrid between the two, neoclassicism and Romanticism. But for Ong, everything starts with academic art. Okay, you guys remember last time we were talking about the hierarchy of different forms of art making, with history painting and religious painting at the top, and things like still life at the bottom. Ong buys into this, and he argues that the lessons of the Renaissance should be learned by every person who's making art, even when it comes to pressing forward into this flair for the exotic. So here is Le Grand Odalisque. Basically, I want you to understand. I wish we were standing face to face with this in the Louvre so that you could see up close the crisp edges of the figure as well as the background. Now, that's particular to Ong's style. So I want you to put that in your head. These are sharp brushstrokes, crisp edges. Basically, they reveal Ong to be kind of like an analytical thinker, in that he is capturing every detail as best as he can, and probably started with a drawing first. So we've already mentioned that this is part of a tradition, and some of those traditions, guys, might show up as part of that new Q2. This is the reclining female nude that we've seen all the way back to Titian, like the Venus of Urbino, and we'll continue to see moving forward. Now, if you look at the Venus of Urbino, just as a refresher, you're going to see that Titian used a different approach. He was a colorist, and he glazed his colors in over several glazes without ever really drawing a line. The edges and feet of this figure, that's all color that's doing what you think are line making. So that's very different than Ong's approach here. I think you can see that the edges in his version of the figure are much more crisp, especially when you look at the corner and edge of the foot. That shadow between the thigh and the leg here, that's all rendered in sharp, crisp line. When you look at the hookah pipe over on the far side, every little detail is delineated, with even the highlights being pretty clearly pronounced, right? Every little feather in that fan is drawn, and basically drawn before it is colorized. So you can see that he's almost obsessive in the way that he approaches line, and that's what he is a master for. Okay, I think you can definitely see it here when you compare Titian's glazes to what has been drawn in specifics here. Look at that brooch on her head as well as the turban on her head, and you can see this is definitely an exercise in drawing first and coloring second. Here's proof. Here are preparatory sketches of Ong's figure and female. And I want you to know that this is part of his process. So we have to kind of think about how the artists proceed in making the artwork, as a way to kind of back up what we're saying about it. So Ong, got to remember, he's a master of line. All right, so you guys are also seeing this work basically pushes the limits on that rational thinking and order. It engages, like they said on Khan Academy, a flair for the exotic, the far away. And that really is more kind of like an identifier for Romantic era thinking. In the Romantic era, we're coming into contact with different cultures in Africa, North Africa, in the Middle East as well, and they are providing ideas and subject matter for an audience that's basically European. They mentioned the fact that Ong had never been to a harem. He totally recreated this out of his own ideas, and he took liberty with the female form in order to make it more exotic and oriental. So I want you to be familiar with that as an idea, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Delacroix in just a second. But so the idea here is that we have a heightened sensuality. Visually, I think Ong is challenging the viewer to feel and sense notions of touch. The feathered fan that you see here brushing up against her thigh should connote in our mind the sense of feeling that touch a physical body part. So that seems to be why he spent so much time on all this visual clarity. We're trying to recreate for the viewer the idea that we are being touched in similar fashion. Um, so, in terms of the large scale figure, I bet you're going to probably need to remember some visual identifiers. You guys remember from the video, some people argue that there are 3 extra vertebrae in her back, that she is incredibly long. Her arms, like the Botticelli Venus or Birth of Venus, basically is way longer than it would be on a normal model. Her thigh is almost disjointed. So he's definitely taking liberty with that like anatomical, rational sense of putting the figure in front of us, but he's doing it in order to make a more lyrical form of the body that's really for visual entertainment. Okay. Now, I think it's important that you remember the patron, the sister of Napoleon, who was then married to the King of Naples. Typically, when we look at these, we're thinking of the male gaze, and I'm pretty sure it was still intended to be read that way. But she was probably going to entertain guests and use this as a conversation piece. And unfortunately, by the time it's completed, they are no longer there. Napoleon's been deposed. So that's why it shows up in the Salon for 1819. In terms of figuring out this thing, I want you to kind of think about those visual descriptors. I also want you to remember this is really a hybrid piece, isn't it? It uses some parts of the neoclassical mode in its exacting detail, but it pushes a flair for the exotic that's more in line with romanticism, and that's why we call this a hybrid piece. It does a little bit of both, okay? Ultimately, then, this is going to be one of the links in a chain of tradition that goes all the way back to what we talked about in the spring, in the fall. These are traditions of the female nude, and that's going to be important for you to remember. Now, give me just a second. This figure showed up on a couple of questions a couple of years ago. So I need to stop the video here and look for the question that I'd like you to take a quick look at. Okay, so I'm going to pause right. All right, guys. So I have found the question from 2017 that basically features on Le Grand Odalisque, and I just want you to read through it with me, okay? In this question, it's a 15-minute question, question number 5. It was the continuity and change question for that year. So let's just read through it together. You guys, if you're thinking digitally now, I want you to think about what we need to do. Mark the question in your mind by first circling the verbs and then doing everything else that we know about marking the test, but do it mentally here. The painting shown is Le Grand Odalisque by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, completed in 1814 CE and first exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1819 CE. Describe at least 2 visual characteristics of Ang's representation of the female nude. Using specific visual evidence, explain how Le Grand Odalisque demonstrates established traditions in the representation of the female nude. Using specific visual evidence, explain how Le Grand Odalisque demonstrates changes from established traditions in the representation of the female nude. Lastly, using specific contextual evidence, explain why Ang deviated from established traditions in his representation of the female nude. Okay, so if we break this down apart, task 1 is basically going to be to describe one of the visual characteristics of this female nude, right? You do it again for task number 2. Task number 3, you have to explain how it demonstrates established traditions, right? So, how does the figure represent as being part of that tradition of the female nude? The 4th task point, how does Legrand Odalisque demonstrate change? So this would be the new stuff that Ong is introducing to make his Grand Odalisque unique and different. Lastly, you would have to explain why these changes are being made, why he deviates from established traditions. And I think from looking at the video, this would be where we would interject the discussion about Orientalism and exotic flair. So, guys, these examples are all on a College Board. They are scored examples that show you literally what the rubric was and what kinds of information we were looking for as a way to kind of support the answer students were likely to give. All you have to do is go to the AP Central page, look up the exam for AP Art History, and you will find all the writing for every exam that's been posted here since we transitioned to the new course. So I think the pages that are most helpful if you're trying to figure out how to proceed are these pages right here, the scoring guidelines that show you task point 1 and what was counted as evidence for a visual characteristic, right? Reclining, propped up on one arm, crossing her legs, looking over her shoulder. For this question, I do believe that we had the picture in the picture book, but remember, you may not on this new exam. So even though these seem pretty obvious, you kind of need to just be able to describe it to someone who might have their eyes blindfolded, right? Sit on your hands and see if you can come up with this list in your brain. And that's the kind of visual evidence that's going to earn you points, okay? For the second task, you guys can see we just repeat one from the list above. And then we have these things here. This is the traditional aspects of the female nude. So here's the draftsmanship, here's the clear linearity. This is something that's been going on since the Renaissance. All of this would be considered rather academic, right? High degree of finish, precise naturalism, meticulous detail. I think those things were all mentioned. Now, don't get overwhelmed by this list. You're not supposed to know all of this stuff, but it gives you, food for thought. These are some of the things that students might say. And given that there are lots of different art history books as well as different videos online, we have to kind of take into account that there's lots of different things that could get the task done. So this is just kind of there for you to look over. I'm not going to assign anything to you from this, but I do think it's a valuable resource because remember that second question, it's going to be a 15-minute question. And it might be something similar to this for continuity and change. Task point number 4, we're dealing with the new things that Ong introduces into the figure. So we now have the exotic showing up. We have the foreign appeal. We have the anatomical distortions. That was a popular one. I remember reading this question that year. And then number 5, why? This is the history, right? So I hope that you're seeing that essentially this is the stuff we've been doing all year long. All you need is the prompt and some practice, and I think you'll be fine for that second question on this year's exam, okay? I'm going to close out of this and go back to the PowerPoint and close out with Ong. Ong is one of the artists who gets popularly copied by and quoted by lots of different contemporary artists. I wanted you to see there was a popular ad campaign just recently. I think it was Vogue magazine. I'm not completely sure, but that's contemporary actress playing the role in much the same way. We have the Guerrilla Girls who used this and quoted the fact that there weren't that many female artists in the Met. So this is a piece that I'm pretty familiar with. But Ong's tradition of the female nude still gets used today. So this is likely to be a cornerstone of your art history course moving forward. You're likely to see it again if you sign up for art history later on. Okay. All right. So guys, in a second, we will move ahead with another artwork, but I think you now have enough information to kind of think about how to attack those 15-minute questions. So I will leave it at that and then pick up here with some more romanticism in a second.